Hello and welcome to Inclusive Presentation Design. My name is Meagan Longoria. I hope throughout this conference you've explored everything PASS has to offer, and I hope you'll fill out a session evaluation if you're watching this during the conference. As I said, my name is Meagan. I'm a consultant with Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. I focus on business intelligence in the Microsoft Data Platform. I'm also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'd like to start out with a question. When you hear the term inclusive design, what does it mean to you? Take a moment and think about it, and then I'll share with you the inclusive design principles that Microsoft actually uses that you can find online. The first inclusive design principle is to recognize exclusion. Designing for inclusivity makes our products and services available to more people. And it reflects how diverse humans really are. The next principle is to solve for one and extend for many. What this means is that often there is what's called a curb cut effect. When curb cuts started being put in at street corners, that's the ramp that goes down from the curb to the street level, they were put in to benefit people in wheelchairs, but they also benefit parents with strollers, people on skateboards, city workers pushing big carts. The idea is that often when we make things more accessible for one group of people, all people benefit. And then we need to learn from diversity. This means putting people at the center of our processes and valuing diverse perspectives. Now, these principles are geared towards making a product or service like Microsoft does, but these are incredibly applicable to the way that we present at conferences just like PASS Summit. I hope you can see that inclusive design is bigger than accessible design. Let's start out with something most of us have probably experienced. How many times have you attended a presentation and the presenter says, "I know this is too small to read, but..." If it's too small to read, why is it on the screen? Well, it's on the screen because the presenter wanted to show something, but they didn't really take into account what their audience gets out of that. Let's try another one. How many presentations have you sat through where it's just a wall of bulleted text and the presenter reads off of the text directly, word for word, and they just don't look very excited? Now, there are multiple reasons why this happens. Sometimes the person is just very nervous, or they're a new presenter and they're practicing and improving their craft. But sometimes they just haven't thought about what this is like for people in the audience, or they don't feel they have enough control over the situation to do something else yet. I think all of this is part of inclusive design as well. For me, inclusive design is really about where your focus is. Most of us, when we start out presenting and we're planning a presentation and what we'd like to say in it, we think, well, what do I want to say? And as we mature and get more practice and figure out what's effective, we might change our mindset just a bit. We might instead focus on what we want our audience to get out of the presentation. And that's a big difference. That mindset is much closer to an inclusive mindset. The thing I hope you understand is that the way that we present affects what our audience takes away from the presentation. You could know everything there is to know about indexing SQL Server, but if you aren't effective and inclusive in how you present it, your audience may not get much out of it, which kind of defeats the point of presenting. This isn't to say that all of your presentations must be perfect or no one learns, but it is to say that the way that you present has a big impact on how people feel about your presentation and what they remember from it. And once you start learning about accessibility, you'll find that nothing is accessible to everyone. There are accessible stairs that don't work for people who use a wheelchair. There are Power BI reports that work great for someone who is colorblind, but not for someone who doesn't use a mouse. So there are many aspects of this, and you'll never get it perfect. But understanding your audience is going to be key to this. Being thoughtful about what you can do to make your presentations more accessible to more people is what counts. So let's start by talking about our presentation environment. Whether your presentation is online or in person, when those happen again in the future, you want to make sure that everyone has a mic. I've been in presentations where there weren't enough mics and we were having to pass them back and forth, or presentations where I needed to do demos, but all I had was a handheld mic. That can be awkward, and it can also affect what your audience gets out of it. So if you can find out in advance, or if you have control over your environment because you're presenting from home, get a mic. Sometimes your built-in computer mic is good enough. If that's all you've got, that's a place to start. But often, if you can invest in it, a mic, if you do a lot of presenting from home, is a great investment. Another thing to consider is, will you have captions? If you are presenting a live webinar, can you have real-time captions? Captions help people who have trouble hearing. They place the text somewhere on the screen so that your audience can read what you're saying as you say it. That's not just good for people who are hard of hearing, though. It's great for people who have a dog that barks while they're trying to watch your presentation, or kids that burst into the room. Do they want to back up the 10 seconds, or can they just catch what you said in the captions? Sometimes people who don't speak the primary language of the presenter have a hard time understanding, and having those captions available can be so helpful for those people as well. Hopefully, as you're watching this, you'll also have real-time captions available because the conference organizers have done this for us. Another option to consider is if you'll need sign language interpreters. Sometimes audience members that are deaf or hard of hearing may request or bring along a sign language interpreter. What you'll want to consider in this case is that they're probably having to spell out tech terms on the fly. So if you can write tech terms on your slides to be spelled out, if it's something you're referencing often, make sure it's somewhere where the interpreter can see it so that they can fingerspell terms that don't have signs. And also make sure any speakers and interpreters are not stuck in the dark. You could spend hundreds of dollars trying to get the perfect lighting, and while that's fun, I don't think it's necessary. Just make sure people can see you. Everyone wants to see the speaker, and being able to see them as they speak helps people understand what they're saying. If it's possible, if you have a way to communicate with your audience, you can ask if anyone has any special accessibility needs beforehand. A lot of times conference organizers take care of this, but it doesn't hurt to ask. You can always ask your conference organizers what to do if someone, for instance, requests an interpreter or asks if there are captions, so that you have answers to that up front and you can quickly respond if someone asks you. Let's talk about in-person conferences. Some of these are beyond your control if you're just the speaker, but there are things to consider beforehand. First, is the location accessible? Is it in a place that people who have mobility issues can access? Is there only one aisle for people to walk down and it's on the side of the room and people are plugging in their laptops to an outlet and now no one can walk through without jumping over cords? go get the layout of your room beforehand if possible, even if you just sneak over there and look in for a second just to understand how things work. Check out the presentation area, whether or not you have a stage. Is the stage itself easy to access, to get up and down? Can you reach everything you need to be able to get to while you're presenting? Make sure that this is available for you and any co-presenters. I've seen a few times where it was a panel discussion or multiple people were taking the stage as part of a presentation, and one of them couldn't get up there because the steps to the stage were not present on the side they asked the speaker to enter from. You don't want to fluster people about getting to the place they're supposed to start presenting. Presenting can make people nervous anyway, so try to remove anything that could cause extra issues. And again, lighting so that you can actually see your speakers and interpreters. For online conferences, something that speakers need to consider is to have a quiet place to present. I know it's hard. A lot of us are working from home right now in different situations. We just need one quiet place to present. Find yourself a corner. If you have a nice room that you can close off, do that. Just try to eliminate extra noise from family members or pets that may be around. If you have a super loud air conditioner or heater, you might take that into account. But generally, just make sure wherever you're presenting from is free of noise distractions. And then you need a background environment that isn't too busy. This doesn't mean you need a professional green screen to do a presentation. It's nice if you have one. I don't have mine up today, but you just need a background that's free of movement and possibly free of really bright colors. If something behind you just outshines you, if you're on camera, that's a problem. We want people to focus on your content and not what's going on behind you. If you're doing a live webinar, you need to be checking your internet connection. It's so frustrating when we're on a webinar and it's going great and we're learning a lot, and then all of a sudden the speaker cuts out. It happens, we get it, everything can't be perfect, but if you can check beforehand, maybe you can avoid that situation. Make sure you have a high-speed internet connection before you try to present. And if you can have a backup of what to do if your internet goes down, even better. All right, let's talk presentation design. And this is my favorite section because there are so many little design elements that you can tweak and some fun tools that you can use to improve your design to make it more accessible as well as more inclusive. First up, let's talk about fonts. Fonts not only give your presentation a specific look and feel, they also affect the readability of your content. In general, you'll hear me provide some guidance through this section, and I'm sure there's an exception here or there, but if you need somewhere to start, these are the guidelines that I use. You probably only want to use 1 or 2 different fonts in a presentation. I think in my presentation here, I use the same font and just change whether or not it is bold or the size of the font in certain occasions. It's generally thought that sans serif is easier to read. So we want to be inclusive of people who may have reading disabilities or visual disabilities that make it harder to glance at your presentation and get the information out of the slide or whatever you're using to present. We want to try to choose fonts that use distinct letter shapes for similar letters. For instance, the number 1, an uppercase I, and a lowercase l. Do those all look like the same letter in the font that you'd like to use, or do they look distinct? In this font, we can see that they actually do look different. The 1 has a cap at the top and a base at the bottom. The uppercase I has just a straight line, and the lowercase l has a small tail that curves at the end. We want to look for fonts that have wider strokes. Not that our letters need to be necessarily wider, but the lines that make up the letters are wider. And we also want to make sure there are space between the letters. Some fonts have letters that are connected, and that is often harder for people to read. So let's look at a demonstration of various fonts so we can see why this might affect readability. The font I'm using in this presentation is called Source Sans Pro. It is a sans serif font. It doesn't have the little caps on the end of the letters. If you remember back to early days of Microsoft Word, you might be familiar with Times New Roman. It is a serif font. It's not to say you can never use a serif font, just pick one that's very clear. So here's another issue that can come up with fonts. You generally want to go for something plain like Verdana. It doesn't have a lot of embellishment on each letter, as opposed to very decorative fonts, that is Snap ITC. It makes that very hard to read, especially if you've got a lot of text on your slide. And then here's an example of having distinct letter shapes. On the left is Arial. There's a difference between the number 1 and the L. But the B and the D in Arial are mirror images of each other. If you look at Callisto MT, it is a serif font, but it does a good job of making sure that the B and the D are different. If you notice, the D has a little tail at the bottom, whereas the B does not. So having those distinct letter shapes can be helpful for people. And when you look up research for this, be aware that there's a difference between reading, as in reading a book or a text-heavy website, versus kind of glanceable reading, which we'll talk about more in a second. But in general, the research encourages distinct letter shapes either way. Here's an example of those wider lines that make up a font. Calibri has thick lines that are used to draw each letter. But if you go for like a Sego UI Lite, it's very skinny, and that can make it harder to read for people with visual disabilities. So let's talk about font size, especially for in-person events, but I still hold this for online events where you're sharing your presentation or your screen. You really don't want your body text to be any smaller than 24 points. And granted, the point size can differ by font, but just use that as a general rule. It would be even better if your screen just had 32-point font, nothing smaller. Because no one wants to squint at your presentation. They want to be able to look up at your screen and capture all that information quickly and not go, what does that say? So let's check out different sizes using my Source Sans Pro font. This is 32-point. This is what you'll see through most of my slides. Nice, easy to read, and because this has fairly thick lines, you don't have to squint at it very much, really, even if you go down to 24-point. That's my minimum, that 24-point. Unless I've got maybe some detailed diagrams that need some labels, I rarely use anything smaller than that. A lot of people go down to 18-point or even lower. Just be aware of how small that is, number one, and number two, of how much room, or how little room in this case, that really takes up on your slide. So when I'm building a presentation and I need to list some things on a slide, I might have point 1, 24-point font. Point 2, same thing. I keep it very consistent, both in font and size, and I make sure that that's as small as it gets right there. Now, that immediately causes people to ask, well, then I can only fit a few lines of text on a slide. And you are absolutely right. You really shouldn't be putting walls of text on your slide. So that large font may cause you to split some things into multiple slides. So let's talk about that. How much text should be on a slide? There is no exact hard and firm rule, but the general guidance is that you really don't want more than 6 objects, 6 ideas, 6 bullets on a slide. If you need more than that, you might want to consider splitting your slides into multiple slides. I've done this before where I put a lot of stuff on my slide and then went back and redesigned it to be better consumable for my audience, and it ended up being 4 slides instead of 1. Go back and see, is it just cognitive overload to have that much stuff on the slide? Did it get really boring for your audience because there was so much stuff? And there are occasions where you need to put quite a bit of text on a slide, especially if you're quoting something. You can use certain techniques to make that work, to make sure there's not a lot of cognitive overload there. So let's take a look. Let's say I have multiple lines of text that need to be read by the audience. I start with line 1, and I explain what that line means to me, what I want them to get out of it. Then I make it gray, a lighter color, and I add line 2. And line 2 is the bolder color, so everyone focuses on that second line. But because I wanted that second line in context with the first line, this is what I can do. I leave it there, but everything on the page isn't yelling at me in all bold colors. And then I can add another line, and that's fine. And then I can add a 4th line. So the line that I'm explaining gets the dark bold text, and everything else is kind of a medium light gray. Now that's going to cause some problems for visually impaired people because that contrast is way less than what we would normally do. This is one of those situations where you may have to make a decision as to what your priority is. Since the line you're talking about is still in focus, I still use this technique sometimes, because then at the end, I'll show a slide that has all the lines in there kind of as a summary or recap. So I made sure there was a time that somebody could read the text with good color contrast. And we'll talk about color contrast next. Color contrast helps people distinguish your text or your non-text content from the background. We want to make text have a color contrast, this is measurable with various tools, of 4.5 to 1. When we're doing non-text things, charts, diagrams, we want to make sure anything non-decorative has a contrast of at least 3 to 1. So let's take a look at some color contrasts with text. Here is some black text on a light gray background. If we change that background to a dark blue, you'll notice that it's just a little harder to read, to distinguish the letters from the blue background. That's all color contrast really means here. It's much easier to make out the letters when there's a big difference between our background and our foreground or our text color. For instance, can you read that? Most of you will probably say yes, but if you compare it to the line above with the much darker text, I think most of you will agree that it's much harder to read this kind of light to medium gray text on a light gray background. How about this? A dark black background with medium gray text. That's also pretty difficult to read. So in general, our aim is for dark text on a light background or light text on a dark background, because those have very high color contrast. Black text on a purely white background has a color contrast of 21 to 1. The purple text that you see at the top, at the title of my slide, on a pure white background has a contrast of 9.5 to 1. Let's look at this one. Blue text on a medium gray background is only 2.3 to 1. So that one isn't acceptable. It doesn't have enough contrast from the background. So I've thrown out a lot of contrast numbers, and I'm going to show you the tool I use the most to check color contrast. This is the color contrast analyzer, and I'll talk about tools more in a minute, but I can grab the foreground color and the background color with that little eyedropper and see that this contrast is 13.7 to 1. That's a great color contrast. And this tool actually shows you what the rules are for various sizes of text according to WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So that's text. We also need to be concerned with diagrams. When I'm measuring color contrast for a diagram like this with 3 boxes and lines connecting them, I need to be concerned about multiple areas. First, I need to measure the color contrast of this box, the dark blue box, to the background, the light gray background. Then I need to measure the color contrast of the text inside the box to the box background color, the fill color. And then if I have lines or other things connecting these boxes, I want to know about the arrow to the background. So if I measure these and get this blue compared to the background, I have a nice 7.1 contrast ratio here. If I want to get the text, which happens to be white, to the background, that's 4.2. So that's actually a little low because that's a text to background thing. If my text is very small, that wouldn't be sufficient. If the text is very large, according to Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that's actually okay if it's greater than 18 point font. Then I need to check my arrow. So I'll grab the gray color and the light gray background, and that's a non-text object. So that's okay at 3.6. Let's talk about charts. Charts have multiple areas in which we need to measure our color contrast. First, for any text, the text to background color contrast needs to be measured. Then we need to measure, in this case, since it's a bar chart, the bar to the background. And we also want to be aware of the contrast between each of the bars when we have multiple series. So when we have multiple colors, we want those colors to be easily distinguishable from each other. So I showed you the color contrast analyzer as I was checking color contrast, but there are lots of free tools available for you to do this. And I'd like to start out, instead of throwing some colors on my slide and checking afterwards, there are tools I can use to plan up front. My current favorite is color.mediaandme.be. This is the color tester, and it's going to show me color contrasts at the top there to see what my colors look like next to each other. Let's say I want to do a darker gray. I can compare those. This tool will show me what text looks like using different colors in my color palette and tell me, based on WCAG standards, whether or not it has sufficient color contrast, but we get our number there. So the blue on the white background is a color contrast of 5.23 to 1. So we can see all of that, as well as just a visual confirmation of how distinct these colors look to us. We want to be sure not to just look at it for us, because everyone has different vision. But this is the first place that I start. So I can plan a palette, make sure the colors have good contrast from what I typically use for backgrounds and from each other if I'm doing diagrams or charts. and then build and not have to go back and correct everything afterwards. When you do want to check, you can get the color contrast analyzer, which I used earlier, and use that to go and pick colors and make sure they have good contrast. There's also a great site called Who Can Use, and it's kind of in between checking and planning. So Who Can Use lets you enter a background and a foreground color and a size in pixels and whether or not it's bold. And then it'll show you your contrast ratio, what that means for WCAG grading, as well as what it looks like to people with different vision. So what does it look like for what regular vision or people who don't have a color vision deficiency? The next several are about color vision deficiencies or color blindness, which we'll talk about next. There's also, though, at the bottom, what does this look like for people with cataracts or glaucoma or just generally decreased or blurry vision? What does it look like in direct sunlight? You may have been in an in-person presentation where there was a bright light from a window or an overhead light shining directly on the screen and it made it a little harder to read. What does it look like in night mode? So this is a great site to help you understand who can use this color combination. That's whocanyuse.com. So that brings up the question of dark versus light background. Is one better than the other? If you put this out on social media, people are very opinionated about it. There's a few things that most people are forgetting. If you work day to day in dark mode, you put, Visual Studio Code or whatever tool you use most in dark mode, that's different than presenting something in dark mode. So what studies are currently saying is that a light background is more effective for reading, but there's a difference between reading and glanceable reading. Glanceable reading means I can look up and catch most things on this slide and not spend several minutes of in-depth reading. So glanceable reading is really the same whether you use a light or dark background during the day in a well-lit area, but a light background is better if you are reading in the dark. So if you're presenting in an entirely dark room, a light background might actually be better for your audience. Now this changes if you have different vision issues. So if you have low vision, because things look a little cloudy, you might actually prefer a dark background. But people with astigmatism may struggle with dark mode. I have a slight astigmatism that's not corrected by my contacts, and so I actually do prefer a light background. This is all to say that got a little nerdy and way in depth, but that you can choose either and have a good presentation that most people can read. Just make sure your color contrast of your content against your background is very good, is very high. All right, color blindness. Color blindness is actually more accurately termed color vision deficiency because most people see some colors. They're just weaker in certain areas. One way to ensure people with color vision deficiency can read your content is to use something other than color to help indicate it. People get this impression that, you can't use color. Everything should be black and white if you're presenting for colorblind people. And that's not true necessarily. You can use color. I'm using color here. But if you need to indicate some kind of meaning with your color, you might want to use a symbol or some text or something else so that it's easily distinguishable from other colors. It's also easier to make colorblind friendly content if you keep your colors minimal. You'll see that I really only use maybe 3 colors, sometimes more, but I keep the number of colors I use pretty limited on most slides. And then I make sure that the colors I am using have good color contrast. You also want to avoid problematic color combinations if you can. Most people are aware that you should avoid using red and green without something else to distinguish the meaning behind those colors. But did you know lots of people also have issues with green and brown? or green and blue in some cases, blue and gray, or green and gray. Blue and purple can even cause issues. So it's not just red and green that we need to be aware of. You also might not know that there are multiple types of color blindness, and there are ranges within those types. So this is one of those areas where everyone is different. Everyone sees things just a little bit differently. So you may not be able to pick colors that work for everyone. So that's when we go back up to our first tip of using symbols or text or patterns to help indicate the meaning that you're trying to convey with color. If you need to test your content to see how colorblind friendly it is, I really like the free Adobe tool that you can find online. So this is the accessible color palette generator, and you can add up to 5 colors. And what it will do is let you know if your colors are too close to each other. So in this case, I now have color B and D in conflict. So if I needed to make them slightly more distinguishable, the white lines in the boxes would go away and it would tell me no conflicts found. So this helps me plan and create an accessible color palette. If anything gets too close, it will let me know. It is limited to these 5 colors, but you are rarely probably going to use more than 5 colors in your slides because you're trying to be rather minimalist with those colors anyway. So this gets you a pretty good start for a safe color palette. And you can adjust it with sliders if you'd like. But down at the bottom is the color blindness simulator. So they take the most extreme cases of different color blindness, deuteranopia, protanopia, and tritanopia. So one is green week, one is red week, and one is blue week. And shows you what it might be like to see these colors together for someone with that type of color blindness. There are other tools that I think are really helpful in this area as well. And so the next tool I'd like to show you is the color blindness simulator. The color blindness simulator allows you to take a screenshot and then paste it in and see what it looks like with a lens of different types of color blindness. So this is red week. Remember, this was our normal, our crayons here. There's a lot of reds and pinks and purples, and then there's a light green kind of in the back. And if we change it to protanopia, that's how different it can look. These all look kind of blue and green and yellow when they're really pink and purple and red. Here's deuteranopia. And here's tritanopia. Certain types of color blindness are more common than others. Blue weak or blue blind, tritanopia, is the least common of these 3. I always make sure that my content looks good for red and green blind. If I can't quite get blue blind, that impacts fewer people. But if I can get all 3, that's a bonus. And it's not that people need to see, let's go back, that this pink looks just like I experience it. It's that it's distinguishable from this red or this orange or this green, if I need to convey that. If it's just a decorative image and we don't care how people experience the color, then you can be less concerned about it. But in general, if you can make things colorblind friendly, make everything in your presentation colorblind friendly, you should go for it. And then that tool we saw earlier, the color contrast analyzer, also has some color vision deficiency features built in. So if I sample, let's do purple and blue, we get our normal color contrast. Change that. But we can also look at a color blindness simulation. So if you couldn't see color at all, that's what this first one is. But here's our protanopia, no red, our deuteranopia, no green, and our tritanopia. So if those are distinguishable to you, then you may be able to use these two colors together. If you prefer a mathematical formula to tell you whether those colors are too close, that's when I would go back to the Adobe tool. Yes, that was a gratuitous origami bird transition to bring us to our next topic. You probably don't need transitions in your presentation. They're usually distracting. If you're going to use them, be purposeful. If you need to indicate the end of a section, you might do a fade to black kind of transition. Do something really simple though. There have been times that transitions, especially the very creative ones, have made people dizzy or sick. We don't want your presentation to make people sick. We also don't want to use a lot of animations. They can be fun, and some of them have a very useful time and place, but we don't really need things to swirl. We don't need them to bounce. Appear or disappear might be the only ones you really need to use often. You want to use animation to focus attention. So because you are hiding something and focusing attention on a specific section of your slide, that would be a good reason to use animations. You don't use them as decoration to say, look what I can do in PowerPoint or Google Slides or anything else. So be very purposeful when you use these features. We also need to talk about interactive materials, especially in this age of lots of remote presentations. It's unfortunate that I don't get to see you and be standing up in front of you. But one way that I can increase the interactivity is to add polls or quizzes or a chat, any kind of feedback mechanism. But when you add those feedback mechanisms, you need to make sure that they are accessible. That means that they have good color contrast, they're easy to read. It also means that they are keyboard and screen reader accessible. Someone once told me that Zoom polls do not play nicely with screen readers. So when I do polls, when I'm presenting over Zoom, I try to use a third-party product like Slido or Poll Everywhere, something that has confirmed that it works well with screen readers. Also, Zoom polls don't show on recordings, so be aware of that as well. If anybody needs to go back and rewatch, it may be a little strange if they can't see it. And of course, we also want our interactive materials to have very legible fonts. It's usually not an issue when you're using a third party or something built into your meeting software. But if you're doing something on your own, just choose a nice readable font. And lastly, allow enough time for interaction. I saw someone do something very smart in a presentation I watched a while back. They told us up front, I'm going to ask you for interaction and feedback, and it's going to use this tool. So please go to this website. Here's how you get there, and be ready with your phone or with the browser window to tell me your opinions or to interact with this quiz. And I'll let you know when we get there. So they prepped us up front so that we could have that ready so that we didn't feel rushed. The last thing you want is to stress people out during your presentation and go, okay, we're going to do a poll now, and give them 10 seconds to answer it, and they're still trying to get the browser window to your poll open. Give people time, and probably more time than you think they need by at least just a little bit, because you know these questions and you could go and choose an answer, but they need to digest what you're asking them before they can answer. So take a nice pause. You can talk if you want while you're waiting on people to answer. Some programs show live results so you can see it as people respond. Just make sure that you aren't too quick to move on. And that brings us to our section on attendee handouts. Especially at Past Summit, we tend to upload slides and demos, but not much else. If you're going to leave your slide file behind, you want to make sure that it's accessible. Do you have alt text on any images? Did you set the reading order? The reading order allows a screen reader to read things in the order that we visually see them. So you probably want your slide title to be read before any content below it. You need to set that to make sure that that happens for someone using a screen reader. In PowerPoint, there is a built-in accessibility checker. There's also an add-in for Google Slides. You can use the built-in accessibility checker to help you find anything you may have missed. I'm going to exit my slide so that you can see it. I actually have it down at the bottom there. So I can click Investigate. And this version has some things missing so that it would be available for you to see. I'm missing alternative text on some images and diagrams that I put in this. So when I leave this slide file behind for you, I would want to fix this. It's a lot of things you don't see during the presentation, but when people want to reference your slides afterwards, it can make an impact. So I'm missing slide titles. Sometimes there are things that are hard to read, which this is on the slide where I did color contrast demonstrations, so that makes sense. And then it'll ask you to check reading order. Do you have the right reading order for your screen reader? So run through the accessibility checker before you leave your slides behind. Let it help you spot things and fix them. And then if you're converting to a PDF, you want to make sure that PDF is accessible. When you convert a PowerPoint file to a PDF on a Windows machine in Office 365, you're getting an accessible PDF. So those alt text and reading order things are built in to the PDF. That's not the case in every configuration and every presentation tool. So just be aware. But also be aware that sometimes leaving behind just a document is actually better than leaving behind your slides. Your slides in general shouldn't be everything about your presentation. Your narration explains a lot of your content. And since people don't have you there to re-narrate your content, maybe you should make a document. And that document should just be the things you want people to take from your presentation and maybe links to tools or information that you referenced during your presentation. A Word document is sometimes better. When you write that document, make sure that you use headings, so those styles and words that say heading 1, heading 2, so that your document is navigable for screen readers. It also gives nice visual separation so people can scan through and find the content they want. Make sure if you have images in that document that they have alt text. There is also an accessibility checker in Word. So do the same thing there. Go through and check to make sure you're not missing any accessibility features that would make it hard for an attendee to be able to read this document. Even better, and I did it without actually telling you today, make a handout available before the session so that people aren't frantically trying to take down notes or capture a URL. Tell people at the beginning of your presentation, I have a handout for you. You can find it at this location. And then they can start from there and take any additional notes, but they'll know that they have that already available to them. All right, coming up on our last section here. And our last big topic is about respecting your audience's background. I think there are 4 main things we can do to respect our audience. First, understand their existing knowledge. How much knowledge do they already have on the topic you're speaking about? Next, we want to make sure to avoid or explain any terminology that we might use that could be unfamiliar to people in our audience. We also want to make sure we're using inclusive language. And then we need to structure and present with purpose so that our audience doesn't feel like we're wasting their time. So let's talk about each of those. We want to make sure that we're not talking above or below the level of knowledge that our audience members have. You don't want to give a 500 level internals class to a bunch of people who just started using SQL Server. We also don't want to go the opposite. If you have a room full of very experienced people, trying to explain every little fundamental thing may not meet them where they are either. So it's hard to know, and people can walk into any presentation at Past Summit and similar conferences, but you can either ask beforehand, ask the conference what type of people attend these sessions, state it in your abstract. Say you're expecting that this topic will be relevant for people who have a few years of experience as a database administrator or a developer. Give people some kind of clue so they know if what you're talking about matches where they're at and what they want to learn. And if you don't know and you can't find out beforehand, that happens a lot, especially at tech conferences, you can ask, if you're doing a live session, what your audience has experience with. I've asked in several sessions, how many people are DBAs? How many people are business intelligence developers or SQL developers? How many people just got started with Power BI? That helps me know if I need to adjust. I probably can't adjust my slides on the fly, although I've seen some people do it rather impressively, but I can adjust my explanations. Make sure that I state some things that might be obvious to someone who's been doing this a while so that I don't lose anyone in the audience. And that brings us to jargon and acronyms. Take a look at these acronyms and see if you know them all. There's the actual description of the acronyms. Lots of people can remember the acronym and they generally know what it means, but they can't remember what the individual letters stand for. I asked for examples on Twitter of this, and the first one that came up was NUMA. Is it non-uniform memory access or non-uniform memory architecture? Now, in this case, the two people who had that question knew what NUMA is for and how to use it. They just couldn't remember the actual word that was represented by the A. In other cases, people may know vaguely what it means, but they don't have a solid definition of it. This happens a lot with OLTP, online transactional processing. We generally contrast that with OLAP, online analytical processing. But people kind of throw that at everything. They'll say, oh, well, something is OLTP if it's a transactional system. So that means anything that is reporting is OLAP, but is it actually designed that way? So there's some nuances and vagueness in definitions, even though the term feels very familiar. This happens a lot, or at least it used to happen a lot, with SSDT, SQL Server Data Tools. I work mostly in business intelligence, and so I spent many years working in reporting services and analysis services and integration services. And I use the Visual Studio shell that provides the development environment for those services, known as SQL Server Data Tools. If you ask other people, they think of SSDT as database projects. If you're less familiar with the development side, you may have a totally different definition, or you might have thought it was SQL Server Development Tools. This is why we need to spell out our jargon and acronyms. We want to at least write it out or explain the terminology the first time we introduce it. So if it's on a slide, make sure that you tell your audience what it means, at least the first time. And if you're going to reference it, if I have a whole presentation about SQL Server data tools, then I don't have to spell it out every time or explain it every time. But we don't want to leave the audience distracted going, what did that mean? Am I missing something? And now they're all Googling for whatever that term means, and they're not thinking about what you're trying to teach them. So make sure that you get everybody on board with your terminology. And then make sure you're using inclusive language. I'll show you some examples. Rather than starting your talk and saying, hey guys, what if you switched that to hello everyone, or a less formal hi folks, because guys is gendered terminology and you probably have some non-males in the room. Another common mistake is to say, oh, it's easy, you just do X, or it's obvious that this is occurring. Well, it might be easy or obvious to you, but it might not be to other people. And you're creating a barrier to the thing you're recommending someone do or notice just by your language. So instead of, it's obvious that, you could just say, notice that this is occurring. You also want to avoid use of terms that refer to specific mental or neurological issues as a metaphor. Sometimes people say, oh, I'm very OCD about how I manage my files, or I'm so ADD, I can't focus. Rather than using those terms, just tell people you were unable to focus. No need to call it ADD. You can say that you are very detail-oriented about how you organize your files. There are lots of other terms that we can use to describe the same thing without offending someone or invalidating their experience with OCD or ADD or bipolar disorder. And then finally, just check your privilege. Don't assume that everybody has the same experiences as you. It's not the same to use the tools we use if you can't use a mouse. Everybody didn't have the same work experiences as you, especially if you're of the dominant culture in the tech industry. So if you are a cisgender, heterosexual white male, you can't assume that everything works the same way for you as it does for other people. Make sure that you're not using language that invalidates someone's experiences or doesn't represent them, because that's probably not what your presentation is really about, but now you've made someone feel unwelcome and they're tuning out. You want them engaged with you, not upset with you, not feeling separated from you. And finally, structure your presentation and choose your words while you're presenting carefully to drive towards a purpose. You hopefully made up an outline as you were thinking about how to design your slides and what to say. And you want to make sure that that outline has either a narrative arc or very focused main points that drive towards the purpose of your presentation. If someone asked you what your presentation was about in 2 sentences or less, you should be able to tell them. If you take the main points out of your presentation, you should be able to tell me within a couple sentences how each of those main points supports that purpose. When you let things kind of wander, sometimes it's fun, but most of the time your audience feels a little lost and they get disengaged because it feels like you're wasting their time because you didn't really prepare. There's a big difference between telling people everything you know about a subject and organizing your presentation so that your audience gets some main takeaways from it. So we have reached the end, and I just want to review with you some of the things that I hope you got from this presentation. First, inclusive design is more than just accessibility. It makes people feel involved and engaged, so it really includes usability as much as accessibility. If you can, ask beforehand about your presentation environment, or if you're presenting from home, plan out your presentation environment. to be as optimal as possible. Make sure you use nice, legible, large fonts. And plan and check your color contrast on text and non-text objects. Consider what handouts you're leaving behind. Do your slides make sense without you? If not, consider making a document. And if you make that document, make sure that that document is accessible. And finally, respect your audience's experiences. That could be their level of knowledge on the topic, or experiences based on their race or gender or other attributes about them. Don't invalidate their experiences just through carelessly chosen words when you want to draw them into your presentation. So I hope you found a few tips to help you make your presentations more inclusive going forward. Again, my name is Meagan Longoria. Feel free to reach out to me on social media. Thank you.